The moment Balthazar Ashenvale materialized in the subterranean archive at midnight, Camille Sable already had her hand on the emergency lockdown panel. She had been expecting someone. She had not been expecting him. He was everything the old records described and nothing she had been prepared for. Tall, impossibly so, with the kind of stillness that belonged to predators who had long since stopped needing to move to be dangerous. His skin was the white of ancient bone china, luminous in the low amber glow of the archive's preservation lighting. His hair was the color of fresh snow, swept back from a face so precisely cut it looked like something a Renaissance sculptor had wept over. He wore a dark coat that fell to his knees, and his eyes, when they found her across 40 feet of silence and shelved centuries, were the deep, bruised violet of a sky about to split open with lightning. Camille did not press the lockdown panel. She had worked too hard to have the city's emergency response team trample through here. "Lord Ashenvale," she said, and her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. "The archive closes at 6. It is currently 12:47 in the morning, and you did not sign the access register." Something moved across his face. It was not what she expected from a vampire lord who had, according to every credible sources she had cross-referenced in the last 4 months, personally ordered the erasure of 3 human historians from the record. Not irritation at being challenged, not contempt. Something closer to surprise. "You know my name," he said. "I know considerably more than your name," Camille replied, and she stepped away from the panel deliberately. Because she wanted him to see that she was choosing this, not being forced into it. "I know what you came here to take. The Ashenvale Codex, specifically the 3rd volume, the one that documents the Sundering Accord of 1887, and your role in negotiating it. I know you want it destroyed before the High Conclave reconvenes in 6 days. And I know that 3 other archivists who had access to material involving your bloodline have disappeared in the last 18 months. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that only existed 40 feet underground. Behind reinforced walls, in a place where the world above was a rumor, Balthazar's moved then, and the speed of it still made her breath catch even though she had steeled herself for it. He was in front of her in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Close enough that she could feel the cold that radiated from him, the way heat radiated from a fire but inverted, the cold of something ancient and preserved. He was looking down at her with an expression she could not fully read, and his eyes, up close, held colors within colors like deep water. "You are not afraid," he said. It was not a question, it was an observation, and beneath it was something that might have been concern. "I am extremely afraid," Camille said clearly, "but I am also prepared. There is a difference." She watched him process that. Watched something in the architecture of his expression shift, not toward threat, but toward attention, the kind of attention that was its own category of dangerous. "The Codex," he said. "I need it." "I know you do," she replied. "But Lord Ashenvale, before you take it or destroy it, I think you should know what else I found inside it. Because the Sundering Accord is not the most significant document in that volume." She turned her back on him. Which she understood was either the bravest or most foolish thing she had done in 29 years of living, and walked to the climate-controlled cabinet in the east corner. Her fingers were trembling by the time she reached it, but only slightly, and she did not let him see. Behind her, she heard nothing, which was the most frightening sound a vampire could make. She opened the cabinet and removed a folder of archival photographs, documents she had photographed and digitized, and backed up across 4 separate encrypted servers the moment she understood what she was looking at. Then she turned and faced him. "In 1887, she said, you did not negotiate the Sundering Accord to protect vampire interests. You negotiated it to protect human ones. Specifically, to prevent the Obsidian Council from enacting the blood harvest across 7 major cities." She set the photographs on the reading table between them. "You traded away most of your own political power to do it. You gave up your seat on the High Conclave. You surrendered your rights under 3 ancient vows. And then, according to every surviving record I have been able to find, you allowed the official history to record you as the architect of vampire supremacy, which is the exact opposite of what you actually did." Balthazar Ashenvale did not move. He stood with the stillness of old mountains, looking at the photograph she had laid out. "You were protecting yourself. she continued, softer now, because she understood what she was saying and what it cost. If the Obsidian Council knew what you had actually agreed to, they would have destroyed you. So you let the human world believe the worst of you. You let them write you into history as a monster, to keep yourself alive long enough to make sure the accord held, or she looked up at him. And then, someone started coming after the archivists who might piece it together. His jaw tightened. It was a subtle thing, barely visible, but she had been studying the photographs of him for 4 months, the few that existed, and she caught it. "Not me," he said. The words were quiet and very precise. "I came here to take the codex, yes, but not to protect myself from the truth, to prevent the Obsidian Council from finding what I had buried in it." Camille looked at him for a long moment. "Then who killed the other archivists?" "A member of my court," he said, and the quietness of his voice was more frightening than any rage would have been. "Who has been working against me for a very long time, and who believes that, if the High Conclave discovers what I negotiated in 1887, they can use it to discredit me before I can expose what they have been doing with the power I sacrificed." She absorbed that. Outside, 40 feet above them, London moved in its ordinary midnight way, drunk and lit and indifferent. Down here, the weight of a century and a half of hidden truth pressed in from all sides. "You saved them," she said quietly, "all those people in those 7 cities in 1887. You saved them and let yourself be the villain in the story." "It is a very old story," Balthazar said, "and I did not come here expecting to explain it to a human archivist at 12:47 in the morning." "No," Camille said. "You came here expecting to find a frightened woman with a key and no context." She met his violet eyes directly. "I am not that." Something changed in his face then, something that had been shuttered a very long time, cracked, not broken, not vulnerable in a way he would allow, but open enough that she could see through it. And what she saw was a man who had been carrying the weight of a necessary lie for 130 years, and was looking at the first person in all of that time who had read the truth and not run from it. "The photographs," he said. "You digitized them. The originals are here, yes, but yes, digitized, encrypted, distributed." She held his gaze. "If you destroy the codex and harm me, the truth comes out anyway. But if you sit down and talk to me, we might be able to use it in a way that actually helps you, rather than destroys you." He looked at her for a very long time. Then, with the gravity of something ancient making a concession it did not make often, Balthazar Ashenvale pulled out the reading chair and sat. Camille took the chair across from him and opened her notes, and somewhere in the deep amber quiet of the underground archive, the story of them began. She had taken the position at the Crosswick archive 8 months ago, which was not long enough to understand the politics of the institution, but long enough to understand that the politics were deep, layered, and occasionally lethal. The archive occupied the basement levels of a building in Clerkenwell that officially housed a rare book dealer on its upper floors. Unofficially, the sublevels, accessible only through a panelled corridor behind the stacks on the dealer's 2nd floor, were maintained by the Crosswick Society, an organization that had been keeping accurate records about vampire activity in Britain since 1619. Camille had applied for the position as a professional archivist with a specialty in pre-20th century documents, and had been hired based on her credentials. She had been told, during her 2nd week of employment, that the full scope of the archive's contents was more expansive than the job description had indicated. She had responded by asking for a full inventory and a better lamp. Her predecessor had retired to the south of France. The one before him had retired more abruptly. Camille had decided within her first month of working with material that described vampire courts, blood laws, and ancient vows with the same clinical specificity that other archives applied to trade agreements and parliamentary records, that the most dangerous thing she could do was be ignorant. She had set about knowing as much as possible. The Ashenvale Codex had been in a restricted cabinet when she arrived, catalogued under a deliberately misleading reference number, and flagged with an access restriction citing conservation concerns. Camille had spent 3 weeks filling out the appropriate internal documentation to have the restriction reviewed, and then another 2 weeks arguing with the Crosswick Society's Oversight Committee, a rotating panel of 3 that met via video call call and seemed to believe that restricting access to important documents was same as protecting them. It was not the same thing. It was, in fact, the opposite. She had finally received temporary access to the codex 6 weeks ago, under controlled conditions, with documentation requirements for every page she examined. She had understood by the end of the first session that the volume was incendiary. By the end of the second session, she had understood that it was not incendiary in the way the access restriction implied. It was not dangerous because it exposed vampire activity in ways that would cause public panic. It was dangerous because it exposed, with extraordinary specificity and corroborating documentation, the hidden act of sacrifice of one of the most politically powerful vampires in Northern Europe. And she had understood, with the particular clarity that came from years of working with documents that people wanted to bury, that someone was going to come for it. She had prepared accordingly. What she had not fully prepared for was the weight of his presence in the reading room, or the way he looked at her notes with those violet eyes that missed nothing, or the uncomfortable, gathering certainty that the man across the table from her was not the monster that history had been paid to remember. They talked for 3 hours. He was precise and economical with his words in a way that suggested he had learned, over a very long life, that words were weapons that cut the speaker as readily as the listener. But when she asked the right questions, and she asked good questions, the answers came in full sentences, and she began to understand the shape of what 1887 had actually been. The Obsidian Council was an internal governing body of the vampire court that had existed, in various configurations, for several centuries. In 1887, under the leadership of a lord named Vorathiel, they had been moving toward a policy they called the Harvest Protocol, a systematic culling of human populations in major cities that they had dressed up in the language of resource management. Because even the monsters, Camille thought, preferred bureaucratic language for their worst ideas. Balthazar had been on the High Conclave, the broader governing body that technically superseded the Obsidian Council, but the conclave had been divided, and Vorathiel had spent decades building his coalition carefully. The vote, when it came, would have been close, and close was not close enough. So Balthazar had gone outside the formal structure. He had negotiated directly with 3 human institutional bodies, the forerunners of what later became the Crosswick Society, and 2 parallel organizations in France and Austria, offering them comprehensive intelligence on vampire activity in exchange for a set of formal agreements that, when filed under the correct provisions of the ancient blood law, would have made the Harvest Protocol legally impossible to enact without triggering consequences that even Vorathiel had not been willing to risk. He had spent 2 years making those negotiations invisible. He had let the conclave believe he was negotiating on behalf of vampire supremacy, had let the human institutions believe they were getting the better of a dangerous predator who did not understand what he was signing, and had built, in the architecture of their mutual misunderstanding, a structure that held. And then he had walked back into court and allowed the official record to reflect that he had secured vampire dominance through strategic human concessions, which was the opposite of what had happened, and which had protected him from Vorathiel, who would have destroyed him for the betrayal. Vorathiel, Camille said. She wrote the name carefully. Is he still alive? He is still on the Obsidian Council, Balthazar said. He has consolidated considerably more power than he held in 1887. He was the one who sent agents after your predecessors. He knows the Codex exists. He is known for decades. He has not known what is in it specifically. He knew only that it was connected to the Ashenvale bloodline's activities in the 1880s, and that it was here. His eyes were level. When the first Archivist died, I began to suspect he had found a way to narrow his search. When the second disappeared, I understood I had run out of time. And you came to destroy it, Camille said, to take it away from him by making it cease to exist. Yes, and in doing so, you would have destroyed the only surviving documentation of what you actually did. She looked at him steadily, which would have left the false record intact and given Vorathiel exactly what he wanted from a different angle. Something in his expression acknowledged the accuracy of that without enjoying it. You were going to sacrifice the truth to stop him getting hold of it, she said. The same logic as 1887. I have never claimed to be uncomplicated. Balthazar said. She laughed before she could stop herself. It was a short, surprised sound, and she saw it register in his face, a slight easing of the line of his jaw, something that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. Lord Ashenvale, she said, I think we need to talk about the High Conclave. The High Conclave reconvened in 6 days. Balthazar had told her this already, but as she began to understand the structure of it, the enormity of the timing settled over her like cold water. The conclave met every 25 years at a location that rotated among the old courts of Europe, and this cycle it was London, which meant it was here, which meant Vorathiel and every other member of the Obsidian Council would be in this city within the week. The conclave session could be used, she said carefully. If the truth about the Sundering Accord was presented with full documentation at a formal conclave session, Vorathiel could not suppress it through the usual methods. The blood law requires formal acknowledgement of any evidence presented at session. Balthazar looked at her with an expression she was beginning to learn to read, the one that meant he was calibrating how much to say. Yes, he said, that is correct. So why haven't you done it? Because presenting evidence at conclave requires a formal sponsor, a member of the conclave, who will stake their blood right on the authenticity of the documentation, he said. And because I am the subject of the evidence, I cannot be my own sponsor. Every member of the conclave who might have sponsored it is either aligned with Vorathiel or has been persuaded that supporting me carries too great a risk. What happens if the evidence is presented without a sponsor? It is inadmissible under blood law and can be destroyed on sight. She was quiet for a moment. What if the sponsor were human? He was very still. The Crosswick Society, she said. They have an observer status at conclave. I found the documentation for it, 1921. After the Great War restructured a lot of the old agreements. Human institutional observers were granted limited standing in formal proceedings. She looked at him. I can present the evidence as a formal submission on behalf of the Crosswick Society. I am the current senior archivist. It falls within the authority of my role. The look on his face was unlike anything she had seen on it yet. It was not gratitude exactly. It was older than gratitude, and more complicated. That would place you in direct opposition to Vorathiel, he said, in a room full of his allies. Without any protection under blood law, because you are human, and the observer standing is observational only. I know that, Camille. He had not used her name before. The sound of it in his voice, in the low amber light of the archive, with his ancient eyes fixed on her, was startling in a way she was not going to examine right now. I did not come here to place a human woman in the path of Vorathiel's intentions. I know that too, she said, but you cannot do it alone, and the people who should have been helping you have been frightened off or worse, and I am not frightened off. She held his gaze. I am the right person for this. Not because I am brave, I told you I am afraid. I am very afraid, but because I have the documentation, the institutional standing, and the knowledge to do this correctly. And because it needs to be done correctly. He looked at her for a long time. Outside the archive, London was still going about its indifferent business. The preservation lamps hummed softly. There are things you need to understand, he said finally, about what you would be walking into. Tell me, she said, and settled back in her chair, and listened. He came back the next night. She had not been entirely certain he would. She had spent the intervening day in a state of concentrated focus that felt like the calm at the eye of a weather system, doing what she was good at, which was working. She built a formal submission package with the care of someone assembling evidence for a trial, which was essentially what it was. She cross-referenced every document in the Codecal and against the external sources she had been able to identify, mapped the corroborating timeline, and prepared 3 redundant copies in formats that would survive physical destruction. She also sent a carefully worded communication to the Crosswick Society's Oversight Committee, informing them that she would be exercising her authority as senior archivist to submit formal documentation to the High Conclave session as per the observer standing established in 1921, and that she was requesting their institutional endorsement by end of business. She gave them 8 hours. They came back in 4, with 2 committee members, strongly opposed and 1 cautiously supportive, which under the Society's rules constituted a non-binding endorsement. It was not ideal, but it was enough. When Balthazar arrived at midnight, she had the submission package complete, and a pot of tea she had made for herself because she had been in the archive for 18 consecutive hours, and her hands needed something warm to hold. He came through the door at the top of the stairs, with the kind of controlled velocity that suggested he had been moving very fast and had slowed himself precisely for her benefit, and she looked up from her desk and said, "Vorathiel sent someone, didn't he?" He stopped. "How did you know?" "Because you are 3.5 minutes earlier than last night, and you are moving differently." She studied him. "Are they still in the building?" "No." The word was quiet and final in a way that discouraged follow-up questions, and she decided to accept that for the moment. She stood and brought the submission package to the reading table. "Sit down. I want to show you what I have." He sat across from her again, and she spread the documents between them, and walked him through the structure of the submission, with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. He listened with his full attention, in the way she was beginning to understand, was characteristic of him. Completely, without interruption, with those extraordinary eyes moving between her face and the documents with equal focus. When she finished, he said, "This is better than anything I could have assembled." "You have been trying to protect yourself for 130 years, she said. "I have been doing this for 6 weeks with fresh eyes and no political fear of the subject matter. Of course it is better. You are a remarkable woman," he said. It was stated with the plainness of observed fact, not flattery. She felt it land in a place she was not accustomed to things landing. "I am very good at my job," she said, which was also true and somewhat safer. Something moved in his expression that she was starting to dread, not because it frightened her, but because it was beginning to move something in her that she could not afford to have moved in the middle of this. "And Camille," he said. If we survive it, I would like to take you to dinner." The word "when" was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and they both knew it. "If we survive it," she agreed, and the warmth that crossed his pale face in response was something she thought about for a long time afterward. The following days were the most concentrated and frightening of her life. Balthazar returned each night, and they worked. She learned more about vampire court politics in 3 nights than she had assembled in 8 months of professional study, because he told her things the documents did not contain, the living texture of the world she was about to walk into. The hierarchy of the Obsidian Council, the particular vanities and alliances of the conclave members who would be present, the unwritten rules of conduct that governed formal proceedings, the moments in a session where the blood law gave protection and the moments where it did not. He was a thorough and precise teacher. She was a thorough and precise student. The dynamic suited them both, but it was never impersonal, and they both knew it. On the second night, she asked him about Vorathiel directly, what he was capable of beyond agents and political maneuvering, what the honest threat calculation looked like. Balthazar was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Vorathiel is old. Not as old as I am, but old enough that his capabilities are considerable. He is also, which is more dangerous than capability, patient. He has been building this particular endgame for 40 years. He looked at her steadily. "If he identifies you as the primary threat to his position before the conclave session, he will move against you before the session begins. In that scenario, the blood law offers no protection because you will not be inside a formal proceeding. What would that look like, him moving against me?" "It would look like nothing," he said. "You would not see it coming." The honesty of that was more frightening than if he had been reassuring. She respected him for it. "What does your protection look like?" she asked. He met her eyes. "It looks like me never being more than 30 seconds from wherever you are, from this moment, until the session ends." She absorbed that. "That is very close." "Yes," he said. "It is." She did not argue with it, for the practical reason that she was not foolish, and for another reason that she was not going to examine until they were on the other side of this. On the third night, something shifted. She was cross-checking a date reference, and he was reading through the conclave's formal procedural rules, which she had sourced from the archive's collection of vampire court documentation, when she became aware that he had gone still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. She looked up. He was looking at her, not at the documents. "What?" she asked. "You have been awake for 20 hours, he said. I am fine. You are not fine. You are exhausted, and you are running on determination and black tea, which is admirable but not sustainable. He set down the procedural rules. The session is in 3 days. You need sleep. There is still material to go through. There is always more material to go through, he said. But you will be presenting this to the conclave. Your presentation depends on your clarity of mind more than on any additional document I might find in this collection. Sleep is not a luxury, it is a strategic necessity. She looked at him. Are you ordering me to bed? Something flickered in his expression. I am strongly advising you, he said carefully, as someone who has survived a very long time by understanding when endurance becomes a liability. She was too tired to maintain her professionalism about it, which was perhaps why she said, more honestly than she intended, Will you be here when I come back in the morning? The way he looked at her when she said it made her breath catch. I will be here, he said. I will not leave this building. She nodded, closed her files, picked up her coat. She was at the stairs when he said her name again. She turned. He was standing at the reading table with the preservation lamps gilding his white hair amber, and he looked, for just a moment, like something out of the documents she spent her life translating, old and precise and carrying an enormous amount of history, but looking at her with eyes that held something entirely present. Be careful on the street, he said. I am always careful, she said. I know, he said. Be more careful than that. She went home. She slept. She dreamed about him, which was inconvenient and inevitable, and she woke up with her thoughts sharply clear, and her heart doing something complicated that she decided to treat as an irrelevance until further notice. The night before the conclave session, Vorathiel made his move. She was 2 streets from the archive, and she was being as careful as she knew how to be, which turned out to be not careful enough for someone who had spent 4 decades planning, and who had resources Camille was only beginning to understand. She did not see the man until he was beside her, and by then the distance was already wrong. Too close and too fast, and she had exactly long enough to understand what was happening before a hand closed on her arm. And then Balthazar was there. She had known he was close. He had said 30 seconds, and she had believed him. But the reality of it, the absolute terrifying controlled fury of him moving through a London street at night, was something the knowing had not adequately prepared her for. He came from above, which she had not anticipated, from the roof of a parked van, and the impact of his landing between her and the man holding her arm was something she felt in her chest like a struck bell. He said one word, one single word in a language she did not recognize. Something old and guttural and final, and the man let go of her arm and stepped back with the expression of someone who has just understood the full scale of a miscalculation. There was a moment, a single suspended moment, where everything balanced on what happened next. Vorathiel sent you, Balthazar said very quietly. His voice was different when I was angry, she noted somewhere in the back of her mind. Not louder, more precisely controlled. More dangerous for the control. And you will go back to Vorathiel and tell him that this human woman is under my personal protection, that she is under my ancient vow, that any hand raised it against her answers to me directly, and that I am not, he said, his violet eyes absolutely level. The version of myself that has been managing his perception for 130 years. The man left. Quickly, Balthazar turned to her. The fury was still there, but so was something else. The immediate checking for injury, the swift scan of her from face to hands, the careful not touching that told her he wanted to touch and was restraining it. I am not hurt, she said. I know. I would know if you were. His jaw was tight. I should not have let you leave without an escort. You said 30 seconds. 15 would have been better. He was looking at her with an intensity that was doing things to her composure. Camille, I know, she said, though she was not certain what she was agreeing to. I know. Let us go back to the archive. They walked back side by side, and she was intensely, physically aware of him beside her, the cold that radiated from him, and the warmth she inexplicably felt anyway. And when they reached the archive door, and he held it open for her with a careful courtesy that was so thoroughly at odds with what he had been 30 seconds ago on that street, she thought that she was in a great deal of trouble of a kind that had nothing to do with Vorathiel. Inside, with the door locked and the preservation lamps warm around them, She sat down at the reading table and pressed her hands flat on the surface to stop them shaking. She was not hurt. She was frightened, and the frightened was coming out through her hands, now that she had a moment to let it. He was beside her before she had finished the thought, not across the table but beside her, pulling the adjacent chair close, and he sat, and he did not touch her. But he was close enough that his presence was a physical thing, warm in the way that made no logical sense and yet was entirely real. "You are shaking," he observed. "I am aware," she said. "It is a reasonable response." "I know it is a reasonable response. I am a reasonable person." "That does not make it less annoying." She took a controlled breath. "The submission package is secure. 3 copies distributed. He cannot erase it before tomorrow." "I know," he said. "I verified the distribution protocol this afternoon." She looked at him. "You checked my work?" "I checked that your work was protected," he said. "There is a difference." She found herself looking at his face from a distance of about 14 inches, which was close enough to see things she had not catalogued yet, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested a face which had, over a very long time, done a great deal of precise thinking. The quality of his stillness that was not cold but was the opposite of cold, concentrated, directed entirely toward her. "Balthazar," she said, which was the first time she had used his name. He was very still. "Thank you," she said, "for not being what the records said you were, and for being what you actually are. Both of those things required a great deal." Something moved through him. She could see it pass through his whole body, the way weather moves through a landscape. He lifted his hand and set it very carefully over hers on the table, the cool weight of it precise and deliberate, not claiming, not requesting, simply present. "Tomorrow," he said, "we are going to walk into that room, and we are going to do something that should have been done 130 years ago." "Yes," she said. "And I would like, when it is done, to take you somewhere that is not an underground archive." She laughed, and this time the laugh was full and real and warm, and she felt his hand flick gently over hers. "Somewhere with windows," she suggested. "Somewhere with windows," he agreed. They sat like that for a while in the amber quiet, his cool hand over her warm one, the weight of tomorrow manageable between them in a way that it had not been manageable alone. And she thought that this was what it looked like, when a century of isolations found something it had not been looking for, and did not know how to handle, and handled it anyway, with the particular grave care of something that understood the weight of permanence. The High Conclave of the Northern European courts convened at 7 in the evening, in a location that Camille had only ever seen described in documents, a building in Mayfair that presented itself to the modern city as a private members club of the very expensive and very discreet variety, which was accurate as far as it went, because pride and discretion were the operative currencies of the vampire court structure. It occupied 6 floors above ground and 4 below, and the below-ground floors contained the formal convening chamber that had been in continuous use since the building was constructed in 1892, 1 year after the Sundering Accord had created the legal and political framework that made such permanent London infrastructure possible. Camille dressed with care, not because she was vain, but because she understood that presentation was a form of argument, and she needed every form of argument she could bring. She wore a dark jacket and trousers that were precise and formal, and she carried the submission package in a leather case that had belonged to her mother, who had been a barrister, because she wanted something of her mother's precision and clarity with her. Balthazar met her outside the building. He was in a formal coat that was darker than the one she had first seen him in, and he looked like exactly what he was, the living inheritor of centuries of power, wearing his authority the way other men wore suits. When she came up the steps toward him, he offered her his arm, and she took it. "Ready?" he asked. "Ask me in 4 hours," she said. He almost smiled, inside. The building was extraordinary in the particular way of places that had never needed to justify their extraordinariness to anyone. High ceilings, dark paneling, light that came from sources she could not immediately identify, and the quality of silence that came from rooms full of people who were all very old and very controlled. She felt the eyes of the room on her from the moment they entered, and she felt Balthazar's arm tighten fractionally under her hand, not in tension, but in deliberate signal. "She is with me," She is under my vow. Proceed accordingly. She had spent the last 3 days learning to read his nonverbal communications, and she was beginning to be quite good at it. The conclave chamber itself was below ground, which somehow made structural sense to her, the idea that these rooms existed beneath the visible city, the way the courts themselves existed beneath visible society. It was long and panelled in dark wood, with a formal table arrangement that she had studied from historical diagrams in the archive, and it was full. She recognized Vorothiel from a single historical photograph she had found in the collection, a careful portrait in oil that someone had tucked behind a cabinet, probably hoping the archive would not notice it. He was as tall as Balthazar and considerably broader, with the same white hair worn long and loose, and eyes the color of frozen amber. He looked at Camille when they entered with the flat assessment of someone calculating a problem. Not a person. Balthazar's hand covered hers on his arm, briefly, deliberately. For exactly the second it took her to gather herself back from the edge of the fear that Vorothiel's eyes produced. The proceedings opened with the formalities she had been briefed on: roll of attendance, confirmation of quorum, acknowledgement of the 25-year interval, all conducted in the old language that was partly familiar from the archive's phonetic transcriptions and partly lost to her. Balthazar translated very quietly, close to her ear, in a voice that was barely sound, and she had the slightly dizzying experience of understanding a room full of ancient vampires as through the medium of his voice, which was a sensation she thought she might revisit at a later time when she had the space for it. She submitted her observer status documentation at the formal opening, and it was acknowledged with visible reluctance from several council members under the 1921 provision. She was recognized as a formal observer with limited submission standing. Vorothiel did not object to her standing. He watched her instead, which was worse, and beside her she felt Balthazar note it and adjust the angle of his body by a degree or two, interposing himself more completely between Vorothiel's sightline and her. She waited. Patience was something she had in abundance. You did not work with documents that were centuries old without developing a profound comfort with waiting for the moment. The moment came in the 3rd hour of proceedings, when the session moved into formal submissions. She rose. The room changed the moment she stood. The quality of the silence shifted. She felt the attention of 50-odd immortals concentrate on her, with the particular intensity of beings who had survived long enough to develop threat assessment as a fine art. And she stood in the middle of it and did not let it move her. On behalf of the Crosswick Society, she said, operating under the formal observer standing established by the Accord of 1921, I submit to this session the documentary evidence catalogued within this package. She opened the leather case. This evidence pertains to the Sundering Accord of 1887 and specifically addresses a significant discrepancy between the formal record of those negotiations and the documented primary source material held within the Crosswick archive. She heard Vorothiel's intake of breath, which was interesting because vampires did not typically express surprise through involuntary physical responses. He was old enough that he should not have made that sound. She began. She had been presenting documentary evidence professionally for 6 years. She had testified before academic committees and legal bodies and institutional review panels. She had argued for the historical significance of documents that most people found incomprehensible. She had stood in rooms where people wanted her to be wrong and been right anyway, clearly and specifically, and without flinching. This was all of that, compounded by the fact that every person in the room had the physical capability to end her life, and the political motivation, in several cases, to do exactly that, and she presented the evidence of Balthazar's hidden sacrifice with the same precision and clarity she would have brought to a graduate seminar. She walked them through the timeline. She presented the corroborating documentation. She laid out the structure of the negotiation in terms that were unambiguous and supported by the paper trail she had spent 6 weeks constructing. She read in the old language phonetically the specific provisions of the Sundering Accord that demonstrated what had actually been exchanged. She was halfway through when Vorothiel interrupted. "This is a fabrication," he said. His voice was very controlled, but she could hear the precise calculation in it, the angle of attack being chosen. The Crosswick Society's observer standing does not extend to the introduction of evidence that contradicts the official record. This submission is procedurally invalid. The 1921 Accord, Camille said, and she had been ready for this, establishes observer standing with full submission rights in matters pertaining to documented historical agreements. The Sundering Accord is a historical agreement. The procedural validity of this submission is explicitly covered under Article 7 of the 1921 provision, which I note was drafted with the knowledge and consent of 3 members of this conclave who are present in this room today. She looked at those 3 members. She had identified them from the archive records. She had included their names in the submission package. I would welcome their clarification if they dispute the provision. None of them spoke. Vorathiel's amber eyes were very flat. She kept her attention on him for exactly long enough to show that she was not frightened by his looking, and then she returned to her submission. She finished presenting the evidence. She set down the final document. She looked at the room. The official record of the Sundering Accord has for 137 years attributed the outcome of those negotiations to a framework of vampire supremacy secured through strategic human concession, she said. The documented evidence shows that the actual outcome was the prevention of a mass casualty event across 7 major European cities, achieved through the voluntary sacrifice of political standing by Lord Balthazar Ashenvale, who then accepted the mischaracterization of his actions to protect himself from the political consequences of having prioritized human life. This conclave now has the documented truth in its formal record. Under blood law, it cannot be destroyed. Under the 1921 provision, it cannot be dismissed. The historical record stands corrected. She sat, the silence was extraordinary, and then Balthazar stood, and he spoke in the formal court language, and she did not need translation for the fact that he was speaking with the full weight of everything he was, and everything he had been, and everything he had sacrificed. And the room was listening in the way that rooms listen when they understand they are in the presence of something irreversible. Vorathiel spoke. There was an argument, formal and controlled and conducted in the old language, and Balthazar translated it into her ear in real time, low and steady, and she understood that Vorathiel was attempting 3 separate procedural challenges in quick succession, which meant he was off balance, and an off-balance Vorathiel was a Vorathiel running out of moves. The conclave voted on the admission of the evidence. 21 votes for, 16 against, with 11 abstaining under protocols she understood had to do with political neutrality provisions in the blood law. 21 was enough. It required 18. The evidence was formally admitted into the conclave's permanent record. The corrected history of the Sundering Accord was entered into the blood law. Vorathiel sat down and his face was utterly still, and Camille understood that still to be the specific quality of an opponent who has lost but has not finished. She leaned very slightly toward Balthazar and said, under her breath, "He is going to try something outside this session." "I know," he said equally quietly. "Which is why I asked 3 members of the conclave to remain in this building for the next 6 hours. Under the blood law, a formal conclave session cannot be violated by action taken within the convening structure until session close is formally declared. Session close will not be declared until dawn." She looked at him. "I may have been planning this longer than 3 days," he said. "You could have told me," she said. "I was not certain you would be comfortable with that level of premeditation." "I am an archivist," she said. "I am always comfortable with premeditation. It is improvisation I find troubling." The almost smile appeared again, and this time it went further, and she thought it was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen in an underground room full of ancient vampires. The session continued for 2 more hours, proceeding through other business that she observed with half her attention, because the rest of it was processing what had happened and what it meant, not just politically, but in every sense of the word. The truth of 1887 was now formally in the record. Balthazar's sacrifice was no longer a buried document in a restricted cabinet. It was acknowledged in the highest formal structure of vampire governance, and it could not be unmade. She sat beside him in the formful chamber and felt the weight lifting from him, not all of it, and not immediately, because he had carried it for so long that the lifting was going to be a gradual thing. But the beginning of it, the particular quality of something that has been held in tension finally being allowed to rest. When the session moved into a formal recess at 2 in the morning, he turned to her. "Come with me," he said. He brought her up 4 floors, through a corridor that opened onto a small room with tall windows facing east, not a formal room, a room that had been someone's study at some point, with old furniture and bookshelves, and, through the windows, the living dark of London in the early hours, streetlight and sky, and the particular beauty of a city that never fully stopped. He stood at the window. She stood beside him. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she agreed. He turned to look at her, and in the ambient light of the city through the glass, his face was very clear, the precision of it, and the exhaustion in it, and the other thing, the thing she had been carefully not naming, which he was also not naming, but which was present between them like weather. "Camille," he said. "Yes," she said, because she understood the question before he asked it. He looked startled by that, and the startlement was so human on that ancient face that her chest ached with it. "You have not heard the question," he said. "Ask it anyway," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The city moved in its soft way outside the windows. "You have done something tonight that I have been unable to do for 137 years, he said. "You walked into a room full of my enemies and you stood in the middle of it and you changed the history of my world. Not for political leverage, not for institutional advancement." His voice was careful with every word. Why? She thought about it, the way she thought about things she wanted to be honest about. "Because it was true," she said. "Because someone had done something extraordinarily good and been recorded as having done the opposite, and I have spent my entire professional life working to make sure that the record is accurate, and this was the most important inaccuracy I have ever found." She looked at him. "And because I have been sitting across a reading table from you for 10 days, and I have come to understand that you have been carrying this alone for a very long time, and I do not think you should have to carry it anymore." He was looking at her with eyes that were very full of something he had not permitted himself in a very long time. "I have been alive for 912 years, he said. "I know," she said. "I have not, in 912 years, met anyone who approached the world the way you do. With excessive documentation and insufficient sleep," she offered. The smile broke through completely then, and it transformed his face entirely, and she thought she was not going to survive this in any meaningful sense of personal composure. "With complete honesty and absolute courage," he said, dressed up as professional competence. She looked up at him. "I told you I was afraid." "You told me you were afraid and did it anyway," he said. "That is the only courage that counts." He reached up and touched her face, one cool, careful hand against her cheek, and she felt it the way you feel the first clear note of a piece of music you did not know you had been waiting to hear. "I would like to take you to dinner," he said, "as I mentioned, when this was over." "You did mention that," she agreed, which was approximately all the coherent speech she had access to at the moment. "Somewhere with windows," he said, which was a reference she had made 3 days ago in an underground archive, and the fact that he had kept it exactly, had filed it away and brought it back now, made something in her chest go entirely warm. "Yes," she said, "somewhere with windows." He kissed her, and it was nothing like she expected and entirely like it should be. Careful and deliberate and old in the sense that mattered, the sense of something that had taken its time becoming certain before it moved. She kissed him back without reservation, and she felt his hands settle at her waist with the particular care of someone who understood the weight of what they were holding. Below them, in the formal chamber, the conclave was conducting its business, and in the city around them, the world was being exactly itself, ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure, as it always was. She was not going to think about the complications. She knew they existed. A human woman and a 900-year-old vampire lord had a category of complications that would require considerable future conversation. She was aware of the blood law provisions around formal human protection status, which she had read in the archive. She was aware of the practical and existential questions that a relationship with an immortal raised for the mortal party. She was aware of none of these things in a way that was going to interrupt her right now. He was aware of them too, she knew. He was precise, and he was thorough, and he had been thinking about consequences and contingencies since before her great-great-grandmother was born. He would want to discuss them. They would discuss them, probably in the kind of extended analytical conversation that they were both apparently equipped to have in archive reading rooms at midnight, and they would find their way through them the same way they had found their way through everything else, by being honest with each other in the place where honesty was hardest. When they pulled apart, she was looking at his face in the London light, and he was looking at her with eyes that had stopped being restrained and were simply looking. "What happens to Vorathiel?" she asked. Not because she wanted to discuss business, but because she was who she was and the question mattered. The blood law requires a formal accounting when falsified institutional records are used to harm parties in good standing, he said. The conclave will convene a formal proceeding. He will lose his seat on the Obsidian Council. His agents will be brought in under the inquiry provisions. His expression was not triumphant. It was the expression of someone for whom justice had a very long context. It will take time. The court structures are slow. Slower than an archivist with a leather case and a forensic approach to historical documentation, she asked. The smile returned. Considerably slower, he conceded. Then I suppose I will be busy for a while, she said. Will you? He said. And the question had a different weight, a hopeful one. She looked at him and understood what he was asking, which was not about Vorathiel, or the conclave, or the formal proceedings at all. It was the question that it had been stilting since the first night in the archive, when she had turned her back on him to go to the cabinet, and he had stood there recalibrating everything he had come prepared to do. I have been considering, she said carefully, what the archive's relationship to the vampire court might benefit from going forward. Given that the last 130 years of inadequate communication between the two institutions has created several significant problems that proper documentation and honest record-keeping might have prevented. She held his gaze. I think a formal liaison role would be appropriate. Someone with the institutional standing and the specific subject matter expertise to work between the Crosswick Society and the court structure on an ongoing basis. Someone who already has the relevant documentation, he said. And the personal connections, she said. And who is apparently willing to stand in rooms full of immortals and argue from primary sources, he added. That too, she said. He looked at her with the full weight of 900 years of knowing what things were worth and what they were not, and what it meant when something was rare. I would very much like, he said, for you to remain involved in my world, Camille. Good, she said, which was perhaps understated, but she thought he understood her well enough by now to hear what was underneath it. He did. She could see him hear it. They stayed at the window until the eastern sky began its slow conversion toward dawn, talking in the way that people who have been through something large together talk, moving between the formal and the personal with the ease of two people who have found that the distance between those registers is for them very small. She told him about her mother, the barrister, who had taught her that accuracy was a form of respect and that the record mattered because it was the only version of events that outlasted the people who had lived them. He told her about 1887 in ways that the documents had not captured. The weight of the decision, the particular loneliness of a choice that had to be made invisibly and lived with for over a century. She listened to him the way she listened to documents, with full attention and without the need to be useful or reassuring, simply present with the truth of what he was telling her. And she felt him feel the difference between that and every other response he had encountered. As the first suggestion of dawn began on the horizon, he said, I need to be below, before full light. I know, she said. She had read everything the archive had on vampire photosensitivity. Not weakness exactly, not the burning Hollywood mythology, but a genuine physical vulnerability to direct prolonged sunlight that was real and limiting, and something she had already been thinking about in terms of practical considerations for any ongoing arrangement between them. He looked at the window, then at her. The formal conclave session does not close until the presiding lord declares it closed. I requested a 24-hour extension for the formal inquiry provisions, which was granted. He paused. There are rooms in this building that are appropriately shielded. I assumed there would be, she said. Will you stay? He asked. There is a library on this floor. She looked at him and felt the warmth of the obvious answer. "There is always a library," she said. "Yes, I will stay." They went below together as the dawn came up outside the shielded windows, and the buildings settled around them into the particular quiet of a place that had seen enormous things happen, and was now resting. And she found the library on the upper floor, and sat in a chair with windows facing a courtyard where the morning light was perfectly harmless, and read through the Conclave's formal procedural records from 1892 onward with the pleased attention of someone who has found an unexplored collection. Several hours later, when she heard him in the corridor, she looked up and found him in the doorway with the careful look of someone checking that the room was properly shielded before entering, and she said, "Come in. The light is entirely from the courtyard side." I checked. He came in and sat in the other reading chair with the particular ease of someone who had been doing things alone for a very long time and was still adjusting to the novelty of doing them alongside someone, and she watched him pick up a volume of Conclave records from the secondary stack she had made and start reading, and the comfortable, ordinary silence that settled between them felt like something that had been waiting a long time to exist. The formal inquiry into Vorothiel took 3 months. Camille attended every session as the Crosswick Society's liaison, a position she had formalized with the Oversight Committee in a meeting that had been heated, productive, and ultimately resolved in her favor. She presented additional documentation she had identified in the archive. She cross-referenced. She answered procedural questions. She was, in the measured language of the Inquiry Committee's formal notes, extraordinarily thorough. Balthazar attended as the primary witness to the 1887 events, and he was, in the equally measured language of the Inquiry notes, unassailable. Vorothiel was removed from the Obsidian Council at the end of the 2nd month. His agents were brought in under the inquiry provisions and dealt with according to blood law, none of which Camille was required to be present for, and for which she was honestly grateful. In the 3rd month, the Obsidian Council was formally restructured, reduced in scope, and placed under the direct oversight of the High Conclave, which was a change that several members of the court had been wanting for decades and which had required exactly this particular collapse of power to become possible. The corrected record of the Sundering Accord was published in the formal sense that such things existed in the vampire court structure and noted for formal acknowledgement in the Crosswick Society's institutional records. Camille stayed late in the archive the evening after the final inquiry session, sitting at the reading table under the preservation lamps, with a cup of tea and the Ashenvale Codex in front of her, not reading it, just sitting with it. She had spent months with this document. It had changed the course of several things. It had changed the course of her specifically. The door at the top of the stairs opened at midnight, which was when she had been expecting it. Balthazar came down the stairs and found her at the reading table, and he took the chair across from her as he had on the first night, and they looked at each other across the familiar width of the table in the amber light. "It is finished," he said. "It is finished," she agreed. He looked at the codex. "What happens to it now?" "It stays here," she said, "in the archive, properly catalogued, correctly referenced, accessible under appropriate protocols." She met his eyes. "That is what happens to important documents. They are preserved." He looked at her with that expression she'd had come to know as the one that meant he was about to say something he had been considering carefully. "I would like to speak to you about a practical matter," he said. "All right," she said. "You are human," he said, which she was aware of, "and I am not." "Yes," she agreed. "There are provisions under the blood law," he said, "for a formal human protection bond, which is a legal structure that establishes an individual human under the permanent protection and standing of a vampire lord. It is an old-world instrument, rarely used in the modern court, but entirely valid in the blood law." He was looking at her carefully. "It confers legal standing within the court structure. It also confers something that is not formally recorded in the blood law, which is that the bond, once made, is permanent in a way that has historically had physiological implications for the human party." She was quiet. "It is not transformation," he said. "It is not what the mythology describes. But over time, a deep bond of this nature has historically extended the life of the human party in ways that the court scholars have documented but never fully explained." He paused. I am not offering this because I believe you need the protection. You have demonstrated comprehensively that you are capable of managing without it. I am telling you it exists because I think you deserve to make decisions with full information. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, when you said this was a practical matter, you were understating considerably. I was trying to approach it procedurally, he said. I noticed, she said. You do that when you are nervous. He looked startled. I am not nervous. Balthazar, she said, with patience and affection. You are 900 years old. You have survived more political catastrophes than I have had hot meals. And you just explained an ancient blood law provision to me as a practical matter. Because you are trying very hard not to simply tell me that you love me. The silence that followed was the particular quality of a silence that follows the saying of an entirely true thing in a room where both people have known it was true for some time. I love you, he said. It was quiet and precise and complete, the way everything he said was. I know, she said softly. I love you too. I have been failing to not love you since approximately the third night in this archive. He stood and she stood, and they met in the middle of the reading room, under the amber lamps with the Ashenvale coats on the table behind them, and the city 40 feet overhead, and he held her with the same careful gravity he brought to everything, and she felt, in the specific way of someone who had spent their life working to make the record accurate and true, that this was precisely what it was, no mischaracterization, no hidden motives, no burden of a lie that needed a century and a half to surface. Just this, exactly as it was. The protection bond, she said, against his shoulder. I want to understand it fully before I decide. All the provisions, of course, he said. Which means you are going to need to give me access to the relevant sections of the court archive. I will arrange it, and I want to speak to the court scholars who documented the physiological effects. I will arrange that too. Good, she said. She looked up at him. I am not afraid of permanence. I want to understand it. I know, he said. It is one of the many things I love about you. She smiled, and he held it with his eyes in the way she had learned he did, storing it. The way someone stores something rare that they have waited a very long time to have. In the weeks that followed, she studied. Of course she studied. She read every document she could access relating to the human protection bond, consulted with 3 court scholars who were initially suspicious of her, and eventually, in the face of her methodical and entirely non-threatening inquiry, became grudgingly admiring. She spoke at length with Balthazar about the practical shape of a shared life between a human archivist and a vampire lord, which turned out to involve detailed logistics, considerable honesty, and several conversations that were difficult and necessary, and ultimately left them both more certain rather than less. She kept her position at the Crosswick Archive. She formalized the liaison role. She began the comprehensive recataloguing project that she had identified in her first week as desperately necessary, and had been delaying due to more pressing matters, and she worked through it with the particular satisfaction of someone doing important work in full knowledge of why it mattered. He was there every night. He began keeping a set of working materials in the archive reading room, which she noted with private, specific pleasure. He was at the reading table on the other side of her lamp while she worked, reading through court documentation or conducting his own political correspondence, or simply being present in the way that she had come to understand was his particular form of expression, a physical proximity that said what he did not always say in words, which was that she was the place he chose to be. They had dinner somewhere with windows on a Tuesday evening in December. 4 months after the night he had materialized in her archive to arrange the document and found her waiting. While the rest was on the 4th floor of a building in Covent Garden, all glass and evening light, and she wore green because she had decided she wanted to, and he wore dark again because he was Balthazar Ashenvale, and some things were consistent. He looked at her across the table with his violet eyes and his controlled face, and the warmth underneath all of it that she had learned to read like a primary source. You seem pleased with yourself, he observed. I am, she said. I had a very good week. I completed the recataloguing of the pre-1800 section. Is that what is making you look like that, he asked. She considered. Partly, she said, and partly this. She gestured between them. to the table and the windows and the lights of the city, beyond the glass and the specific improbable fact of them. I was not anticipating any of this when I took the position at the Crosswick Archive. Nor was I, he said. When I came to destroy a document 8 months ago. That is the problem with accurate records, she said. You never know what you might find in them. He reached across the table and took her hand. The same gesture he had made in the archive that first night, but different now. Not careful because restrained, but careful because chosen. The weight of his hand over hers, the weight of something that had made itself permanent with the knowledge of what that meant. I believe, he said, that I owe you a formal apology for arriving with the intention to erase your archive. You owe me a conversation about the post-1887 Conclave records that you have been withholding on the grounds that they are politically sensitive, she countered. That too, he acknowledged, outside. London went about its magnificent ordinary life, and in a room with windows that she had requested specifically because he had remembered her asking for it. Camille Sable and Balthazar Ashenvale sat across from each other with the truth between them accurate and preserved and permanent, and the record of them began. She formally accepted the human protection bond on a Friday in February, in a ceremony that was small by court standards and enormous by any other measure, conducted in the conclave's formal chamber by a court official who was clearly moved in a way that official neutrality barely concealed, because it had been a very long time since the chamber had seen anything that looked like this. She spoke the formal words of the bond clearly and without hesitation, because she had memorized them 6 weeks ago and had been ready since the moment she finished the relevant documentation. And Balthazar spoke his with the full gravity of someone who understood better than any living being in that room what permanence meant and was choosing it without qualification. His hands were cool on hers, and his eyes, when they met hers after the final word was spoken, held everything that 900 years of living had taught him about what was worth keeping, and she was on the short list of things that had been worth all of it. The court witnesses applauded in the formal manner, which was a single synchronized motion that sounded like thunder in the old chamber. She leaned up and kissed him, which was not part of the formal ceremony, and heard something in the chamber that might have been additional applause, and definitely included at least one court official making a sound that was suspiciously close to a sentimental exhalation.
You deviated from the formal procedure,
he murmured against her mouth. I am documenting the moment, she said, accurately. He smiled against her, and it was the full version, the one that had taken him 900 years and 10 nights in an underground archive to produce. And she kept it the way she kept everything that mattered, precisely, and with great care. The archive was 40 feet underground, and the city was overhead, and the truth was in the record where it belonged, and the story of them was exactly what it was. No mischaracterization, no hidden cost, no ancient lie between them. Just the amber light and his hand in hers, and all the time in the world to get it right.